Writing doesn't have to be a solitary activity. That's why we host in-person retreats and workshops. At the Writing Excuses retreats, you'll get access to classes, one-on-one office hours, critique sessions, and activities to keep you inspired and motivated. Become a more engaging storyteller and learn how to navigate the publishing landscape. As you make meaningful progress on your stories, you'll also build connections with your fellow writers that will last for years to come. Check out our upcoming events at writingexcuses.com/retreats.
This episode of Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. If you would like to learn how to support this podcast, visit www.patreon.com/writingexcuses. Season 19, Episode 44. This is Writing Excuses.
A close reading on structure, tradition, and innovation.
15 minutes long because you're in a hurry.
And we're not that smart.
I'm Mary Robinette.
I'm Dongwon.
I'm Erin.
And I'm Howard.
So this week I wanted to talk about another aspect of fifth season, and I think we're going to zoom out a little bit and a little farther away from the text. And this is coming from a little bit of my perspective, both as an English major and someone who almost went into academia, and also as a publisher. But one thing that I'm really interested in talking about this book is the way it fits into the lineage of fantasy novels. And I think this is a really interesting thing to think about when thinking about how to structure a book, how to frame a book. And this kind of touches on some stuff like Hero's Journey kind of things and the way that's used in fiction, but also just the place that this book has in the canon of fantasy literature, to use a loaded term. And so, in a lot of ways, modern epic fantasy is established by Lord of the Rings, and a lot of it is descended from that. I think fifth season is a really interesting break from that tradition that nonetheless is in conversation with it, right? One thing that struck me on my second reading of the book several years ago was how much of it uses the classic fantasy tropes, right? To me, it felt so contemporary and so fresh and so different. Then I stepped back for a second and said, wait a minute, this is a book about wizards who go to a magic school and use crystal magic. And I was like, this is just the most classic fantasy I've read in a second. Like hearkening back to like Tolkien 70s, 80s fantasy, in the way she pulled from that and yet flipped it and reversed it to create such an exciting, fresh work.
One of the things, I'm glad you brought this up. One of the things that I also love about that in that is that much like when you look back at the Wizard Master, the Wizard of Earthsea, that magic does basically one thing. You use words and you can change things. And yes, there are 9 different masters, but it's basically you use words and you can change things. And the thing that's happening here is you've got one thing they can do. They can do some vibrational stuff.
Yeah.
And it's all of the different ways in which it can be twisted and pushed and then is in conversation with this whole larger body of work that is outside of fantasy that causes it to be doing some really interesting, fresh things. Mm-hmm. Also, I just need to put out a little shout out to Dark Crystal, which is my favorite crystal magic.
Yes.
I just find the phrase "in conversation" with such an interesting one because some of it is like we don't actually know. Like we believe that a work is in conversation with another work. I remember earlier you were saying that this work is maybe a little bit in conversation with Octavia Butler. Mm-hmm. I agree with all these things, but it's interesting. Like, how do we know sort of what tradition a book is drawing from? How much of that is the book doing it and how much of it is us doing it? Because we bring our own context with us. And so we're like, oh, I see these things here and I've seen them in other places. Yeah. It's a really interesting thing, unless you ask the author, which we will. It's hard to know.
Well, it's the difference between sort of intent and the reader, right? Mm-hmm. I'm my subjectivity, sorry, we're getting a little academic here, but my subjectivity as the reader is projecting all of the stuff that I've read, right? Like, I'm not super familiar with Dark Crystal, so I don't see that. I am familiar with Earthsea and Lord of the Rings and, Parable of the Sower. And so for me, I'm seeing this book as being deeply in conversation with those three things. We were off mic talking about Omelas as well, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, another Le Guin story that this feels very in conversation with as well, right? And so I think what traditions it's pulling from is fascinating.
So for me, one of the definitions of genre is that it is literature that is in conversation with itself. that you are both not just that it's the writer is thinking about it, it's that it is the readers are having conversations about it. So regardless of what Nora intended with this, because of the way it's being read, because of the way it's positioned, it is in conversation through the conversations of the readers. And actually, as we were talking about it, I think for me, I said Dark Crystal because it is, puppets. But for me, the thing that it actually brought to mind more was Crystal Singer, which is a much older
McCaffrey.
McCaffrey. Sorry, my brain just. And similar, one of the similar things there is that you have to have this particular skill, which is in that case perfect pitch, and then you go to this planet and you go through this transformation. And some people get turned into rock people by accident, but you are locked into this career now because you can no longer exist. There's a symbiote in this case is the mechanism, but it's still that idea of this being locked in, being enslaved for the benefit of this other civilization that then convinces you that the reason it's okay is because you are highly valued, so that then the characters become part of their own narrative.
I just realized that's exactly like being a web cartoonist because I could no longer exist without the internet.
Also, you started
I was
turning
just
into
going to
rock.
die.
So.
Yeah, you
I started turning into a rock.
Yeah.
No, the important thing that I was going to say was that whether or not the author is consuming, is aware of, is having a conversation with the genre, the reader probably is. And the best example I can think of for this is the TV show Heroes, which when it came out, a bunch of us said, we've already read this comic book. It's just the X-Men. Why are you trying to retell it? We've already done this. Heroes was wonderful. It did neat things, but it was trying to do so without the audience having read comic books, which can't happen. And so when you talk about tradition and innovation, it's entirely possible to convince yourself through anxiety of influence that you are innovating because you're not reading everything else. That's probably not the way it's going to be read.
One thing that I think about with fifth season is it is deeply in a lineage and in a tradition. And I do think Nora knows that, or N.K. Jemisin knows that. But and how she thinks about it, I'm very curious to hear. I've not had a conversation with her about it. But one thing that I do think is really important is that this book also represents a rupture. This is a very stark departure from one of the core, what I think is one of the defining impulses of epic fantasy. And what I also think is exciting that because of this rupture, we've seen the start of a new lineage. I see fantasy works now in conversation with fifth season rather than Lord of the Rings, as they the Poppy War is the example that springs to mind the most. And because what I see the difference is most epic fantasy, I'm not saying that N.K. Jemisin was the first person to do this, but she did it, I think, in a way that was very effective and sort of opened the genre up, is most epic fantasy is what I think of as restoration fantasy, right? So Lord of the Rings, the world was good. It has fallen through the rise of Sauron and just the general rise of the Age of Men. And the goal is to restore the former glory. The goal is to get Aragorn, the heirs of Numenor, Numenor, back on the throne. And that is so much of what that book is about. The farm boy finds a magic sword, can defeat the evil, restore the kingdom to a place of justice and glory and good. It is about restoring a former order, right? And this is part of what makes a lot of epic fantasy inherently conservative, because it's saying things used to be good, we need to get back to those ways of being, right? Fifth season is saying the exact opposite of examining structures over and over again and saying these things are broken beyond repair because we are exploiting people, damaging people, hurting people in a way that the only answer is to burn it down and start something new, right? Or it's not even particularly interested in what the new thing we start is. It is interested in the examination of what has gone wrong and how to rate this point, to the point that we as the readership, I don't know that every reader is feeling this way, but are coming around a little bit to maybe Alabaster was right. Maybe he had a point. This is the Magneto is right argument for X-Men fans, of which I've been a big proponent of. This is Killmonger's right. This is siding with the villain a little bit because restoration can't be the answer for everybody.
There's a line in the book that is, the world is what it is. Unless you destroy it and start all over again, there's no changing it.
Exactly. And speaking of accepting things being the way they are, let's go to break for a moment and we'll be right back.
I want to tell you about Family Reservations by Liza Palmer. This is so good. It is not a science fiction or fantasy book. This is mainstream. You should read it. It weaves together some of the most complex family dynamics I've seen. Partway through it, I was thinking, oh, this is King Lear. Liza describes it as Succession meets fine dining. So it has some of the most delicious food descriptions ever. The story does a beautiful job of handling omniscient narrator, and I highly recommend it, not just because it's a fantastic read, but also because it is a masterful use of omniscient narration. If you've been wanting to play with this tool, this book is a really good one to read to see how it's being handled in a modern context, although you should expect to come away being very hungry.
Okay, before the break, Mary Robinette, I think you had a point that you were trying to extend on with the quotation of that line.
So it's just that, when we talk about things that are in conversation, and when you look at when this book was written and the conversations around Black Lives Matter and, breaking the world, there are parallels that a modern reader will bring to that, whether or not it is intended. And then I think also one of the things about it for me that is interesting structurally is that if you think about the structure of the book also breaks structure. Like it is not structured the way you've seen other books structured. And that is part of what makes it feel so fresh is that we aren't seeing a regurgitation of the hero's journey, although she is repurposing parts of it. Like, when you look at a hero's journey, there's a mentor, there's a character, like Alabaster is literally called her mentor. The Guardians, one of the other things that happens when they go into the threshold is that they, in the monomyth, you meet the Guardian, and they are literally called the Guardians, but they are the evil ones in this. It is interesting to me that then the way that first book works, it interrupts the hero's journey at what some people call the dark night of the soul. Sometimes people call it the descent into the abyss, where we literally go into the earth. But it is fundamentally not the hero's journey. Yeah. This book is fundamentally not that. It is taking those elements, it is breaking them, and it is repurposing them to build this entirely new structure.
And I think it's like bringing new things in. I mean, it's so funny to think about the hero's journey. It's awesome, maybe. It's there, but like it is only one small. There are a lot of ways to tell stories.
Yes.
There are a lot of traditions of storytelling. We have a small one that we've taken and sort of like that has been part of fantasy that I think does come from that Tolkien way of thinking. And I feel like one of the things that I've been really loving in recent works in general is seeing different ways of telling stories coming into things. And I think that probably there's also some of that this book is in conversation with, even though not everyone may know that that's a voice that's being added to the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's something really cool that books can do, which is that you don't have to understand every single thing that a book is working with in order to enjoy that story, in order for that story to be influential on other stories that are being told.
Exactly. It goes into the ambient conversation in space, and then people start responding to it.
Yeah. And one of the things that I particularly enjoyed is that each kind of track of the story has a different structure.
Yes.
That works with each other. So Damaya is very like, oh, here is the orphan child who is becoming the chosen one kind of thing. Cyanite is getting very much the reluctant hero journey. For the beginning of it. But then when you start braiding them together, when these things are working in parallel, they fracture, they go in different directions. And then you've got this other thing, the whole second person section, which doesn't play by any of those rules.
Mm-hmm. This is a trick I think of most clearly used in Game of Thrones, where each POV character is in a different genre of story.
Mm-hmm.
Some are in an event, like, you have, what's the young girl's name? I'm blanking on her. But each of the characters are like, some are in an adventure story, some are in a political story, some are in a straight up horror story, right? Some are in a supernatural story, some are in a grounded political fantasy. And N.K. Jemisin has done that here, where, again, we have the child coming into her own power. We have the wizard at the height of her power exploring the world. And then we have the very contemporary sort of like tragic hero story. And again, going back to the parallelism, or the POV, realizing that all three are the same person is just makes it a stunning trick in terms of how it operates within the genre conversation.
I was just reading a bit from Leverage Redemption, the new seasons of Leverage, and one of the characters says, "Hey, look, we're going to mess this guy up pretty hard. Are we the bad guys here?" And Sophie says, "Oh, yes. Never forget that, Brianna. We're not heroes. We're just necessary." And I love that moment because in one context, yes, you're necessary, and I'm siding with you. You are hurting this person, but you're doing a good that needs to happen. And on the other hand, I look at it and say, in context of fifth season, well, this is probably how the Guardians feel about themselves. Oh, we're not good guys, but we're necessary. And just that brush stroke across the Tolkien line of black and white, good versus evil, that silvery gray brush stroke that just shimmers and invites you to stare at it. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interlude at the 1/3 mark in this book, which, arguably the end of Act 1, sure. But it literally says, "A break in the pattern, a snarl in the weft. There are things you should be noticing here, things that are missing and conspicuous by their absence." And I think that's one of the things that makes this so powerful, is that she is... there's a line from Hemingway that says that a story is the things that you leave out. And the things that she is choosing not to show, the structural elements that she is choosing not to use. We don't get the reconciliation. Mm-hmm. We don't get the restoration. All of those things that are being left out on purpose are what makes this so interesting.
Yeah, in an earlier episode, I referenced how she calls out, "I'm not going to tell you the nice part of the story."
Yeah. It's rude.
When we talked earlier, previous episode about Aaron and I had this conversation offline about sometimes we'll just read spoilers because we want to know what happens, but we still want to enjoy the story. A story is an unfolding, and it is also a telling. Mm-hmm. And I can appreciate the telling without the unfolding, and I can appreciate the unfolding while not paying attention to the telling. And the consuming media with that in mind feels to me like a break with tradition. Mm-hmm. It also, and I'm just going to put a pin in this, argues really well for this book because it's so well told. The telling is so much more than the unfolding. Yeah. And that's why we would encourage you to read it more than once.
I have one question that's a little bit of a pivot. As a publisher, I've talked about this a lot on the podcast and elsewhere. I think in comp titles, right? I'm inherently wired to think this book is like these other books. This book is in conversation with these other books. I'm curious, as writers, are you guys actively thinking about lineage in that way, or a canon in that way, in the idea that a canon can be a personal thing, right? In terms of like what you've read and where that comes from.
Definitely, I've never done anything like Jane Austen with magic or The Thin Man in Space.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. So I think you're very unaware of your influences.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely never done Apollo era science fiction that was influenced by Ray Bradbury. Absolutely haven't done that. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know that I mean, I know what I've read, and if I could reconstruct, the things that have made me who I am as a storyteller. I think it's a lot of things, though. I think some of it is canon science fiction. I think some of it is barbershop tales. I think some of it is a lot of things, And I do think that this is something that I a lot of times will challenge students to do, which is to think about what has made you the storyteller that you are.
Yeah.
And who are you then telling stories to?
Yeah.
And I think those are two really key things, because otherwise other people will tell you. Like when you put a book out in the world, anyone can tell you who you're in conversation with. But when you're writing it, you get to decide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at that moment, take the power and say, this is who I am, and here is how I want to tell this tale.
The better you get at reading, at comprehending what you read, the more able you are to, when you write, to consciously say, I am writing like the things I have consumed, and to be able to say, I am going to attempt to write unlike the things I have consumed. I am aware enough of the traditions I've been consuming that I'm going to break with them, and I'm going to write differently than them. And I see that as a late career skill. It takes a long time to develop, and you develop it by reading.
And that's what I love about Fifth Season is it is both deeply honoring and in conversation with the traditions that it comes from, but also is so deeply interested in being like, I'm doing something different, Aaron, I really loved what you said in terms of the books that made you a writer, or like the things that you're the stories, not even just books, right? We're pulling from all parts of our lives. For you, that being different from the conversation that you think the audience is, like, who is this for? What books are they reading? What books will they know and understand? And then thirdly, the one that you can't control in any way, which is what people will actually say your book is like, right?
Mm-hmm.
What people will say once it's out in the world. And I think your relationship to each of those three different interpretations is really, really important. As a publisher, I'm most interested in the second one, the one that I want writers to come in with is an understanding of, here's my audience, here's what they're reading, this is like that. But you understanding for yourself why you're writing this and where you're coming from, I think is so important and so powerful.
I think it is the most important thing to know why you're writing it and who you're writing it for.
Yeah.
Because you can lose yourself. I mean, I think it's important, you want to get published, you want your stuff out in the world. But I think if you lose hold of who you are as a storyteller, then you won't be happy with the story, no matter how successful it is and no matter how many other people like the way that you told it.
100%.
Yeah. It is a common thing that I will see with when I was going through the slush pile, that I would see people attempting to mimic someone else.
Yeah.
And then seeing people thinking about what does this editor want? What does that editor want? But it is that thing about what you want. I'm also going to say one other thing about the conversations that we're having. I would not be surprised if Nora had read Crystal Singer and forgotten that she had read it, and that turned up in the book, because I have, when I've gone back and reread some things, I've been like, oh, I didn't actually think about the fact that, when I was writing Glamorous Histories, I'm like, I'm going to do this something fresh and new with my magic. It's all going to be based on folds and threads. And then I'm watching Wheel of Time. I'm like, oh, look at them using folds and threads. No consciousness of that. But this is what we're talking about, that you can be influenced by something. It can come into the book, but it's still your own.
Yeah.
It's still your own, even if you have been in conversation with something and forgotten that the conversation happened.
This is me talking about patterns once again. That's okay. That's how stories work. We are all absorbing stories that we've read. We're all absorbing fiction that we've engaged with and recombining it and putting it back together in our own ways, right? So just because a reader will come up to me and be like, hey, this is just like that thing from, that Anne McCaffrey did, doesn't invalidate your work at all. Your work is still your work, right? Yeah. So don't let that throw you. It's okay to have influences. It's okay to come from a place. And in fact, I think it's one of the most important things is to recognize that you come from a place and try to understand that. And if you don't have a perfect understanding of it, that's fine too.
Yeah.
And with that, I have some homework for you, very much along these lines. I I want you to make a list of the books that you consider the antecedents to this book that you're working on now. What works is your book in conversation with? Are you following on and building on that foundation, or are you disrupting and pushing back on that legacy in one way or another?
This has been Writing Excuses. You're out of excuses. Now go write.
Have you ever wanted to ask one of the Writing Excuses hosts for very specific, very you-focused help? There's an offering on the Writing Excuses Patreon that will let you do exactly that. The private instruction tier includes everything from the lower tiers, plus a quarterly one-on-one Zoom meeting with a host of your choice. You might choose, for example, to work with me on your humorous prose, engage Dongwan's expertise on your world building, or study with Aaron to level up your game writing. Visit patreon.com/writingexcuses for more details.
Writing Excuses has been brought to you by our listeners, patrons, and friends. For this episode, your hosts were Mary Robinette Kowal, Dongwan Song, Aaron Roberts, and Howard Taylor. This episode was engineered by Marshall Carr Jr., mastered by Alex Jackson, and produced by Emma Reynolds. For more information, visit writingexcuses.com.